Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the May 18th session of Bellingham City Council Committee meetings. This afternoon, we're going to start with we're going to start with planning. Jack Weiss is chair.
Thank you, Jane. On the committee with me is Terry Borneman and Dan Hamill, and we have one item today. It's an update on the rental registration safety inspection program implementation. And the last time we had a report was probably about a month and a half ago, maybe, something like that. Anyway, Rick Sepler, our planning director, will provide some information about that.
Sure.
John.
Good afternoon, members of the council. I come before you today to update you on our progress to date, provide some materials for your review, and to fill you in on likely next steps. Again, no action is proposed today and requested. And as far as rental registration, we are still on track for a July 1st launch and an August 1st completion. Due to the excellent work of a fairly interdisciplinary team that includes finance, IT, and planning, we have workable and actually in some cases exemplary online tools for registration, written forms for submission by mail, and have perfected in-person registration. And we have supporting materials that are now on our website to encourage that. However, registration is not open at this time. It's still being perfected. We have a beta version of the online program. We did do a first mailing on the early part of May. That was a design mailing to get response. We did receive a lot of response. A number of folks called and asked about the program. The single largest response total was on applicability. Would my unit now be subject to that? Questions like I've bought we own a condo. My son or daughter lives there and is going to Western. Is that considered a rental? And those issues have been addressed. If there's no rent that's exchanged, it's an ownership. But if there are roommates or if the individual is paying rent, it's a rental. And that's consistent with the state law on that. We feel fairly good also in that we started to get the cards back that are undeliverable. That was our hidden purpose of the mailing, if it would, and that is so we could track down the actual location of the current owners. What I could say is the assessor is behind a number of months in those dates. Often people move their place of residence and don't notify the assessor, and we just want to make sure when we actually send the next mailing, which will go out in early June, announcing that registration will be open July 1st, we have the best information possible and we get it to the most folks out there. So in general, fairly successful. In terms of rental inspection, as you recall, that is linked to the permitting program. We've had good progress on that program. We are still looking at first quarter of 16 to initiate the actual inspection work, and that's consistent with everything we've talked to you about before. I've included in your packet our budget update. I think you've seen this before. It just includes some minor adjustments as we've refined our costs in terms of both programs and administration. A couple of things I'd point out for your consideration. The first is we believe that a half-time office assistant will be warranted rather than a full-time due to a number of provisions in the program to save time, and that's a savings that will be passed on. It will include one full-time inspector. There are 2,700 inspections per year, every year, and that's beyond the scope of what we can carry with our existing staff, so we'll hire an inspector. That inspector would be credentialed to be able to do regular inspections too. So in the event of vacations or illness, we could have our regular inspectors flip in and help out. And also if there's a need to do multiple inspections in shorter order, we could do that too. It gives us greater flexibility on that. We have added resources based on good advice from a number of parties dealing with low-income tenants. That's an outcome of both meeting with Western Washington University, who brought up the issue, and then talking with social service providers. Tenants who have access and resources will be able to avail themselves of the landlord-tenant protections should they be unable to continue in a location. However, those who are somewhat challenged economically would not have access to those resources and run the risk, even though they have entitlements under landlord-tenant to $2,000 or 3 months' rent, whichever is greater, would not be able to follow through on that. So you'll note low-income tenant support included. And that provides us a little bit of a safety net and will ensure that all parties would have access to exercise their rights in the law. I should note that the fees that are shown are the estimated fees. That would be once every 3 years you would pay the amount that's in shading. That's the total, and that's per unit. Folks asked, what is the column to the right? There is provision in the ordinance, as you recall, for private inspection. Private inspections allowed under certain parameters. We have to have qualified inspectors. We have a class included to make sure everyone's on the same page. However, there is a cost to the city of recording, noticing, and following up on those inspections. And that cost would be $41 at this point per unit. So if you did the private route, it would be $41 every 3 years. If you did the public route and let us inspect it, it's $97 approximately. And we'll finalize those in the coming weeks, likely coming back before you with a fee schedule within a 3-month period. Still waiting for some last perfection of our software costs before we come in with a finite amount. We should note that the inspection checklist is in near final form. It is online, and we've received some comments on that. We'll consider all of those comments. If modifications need to be made, we'll certainly address those. We have included the enforcement strategy for you. This is an early draft. The strategy itself is in response to neighbors and others who've asked, how are you going to enforce this? What's your approach? Do you have a structure for it that would be beyond the normal mechanisms the city and planning and community development have in place to address these issues? This is not an actionable item for council, although we will be coming before you with a resolution for enforcement priorities, the ranking of what we deal with to provide guidance. I'll speak to the latter matter at this point. Enforcement priorities are important because the nature of enforcement inquiries are wildly varied, and we need to be sure we focus on the most important things first. It's uncontested that if it's a life safety issue, it's an immediate response. However, as one works down the hierarchy, an illegal use should trump, one would think, inadequate parking, since the illegal use would have a more adverse effect on the neighborhood than the parking. Though I imagine some neighbors might think that debatable. Typically, it's a transitory problem that can be remedied over time. In looking at the enforcement strategy, this is an early draft. It does show our general response, and that is typical enforcement involves a variety of things. It involves spot checks. For example, when you deal with vacation rentals, you use Craigslist and you do spot checks. It's a great deterrent. Similarly to, I think, what DNR does with fishing license. They do spot checks to make sure people have purchased them. You don't check everyone, but you do it occasionally. And the thought that someone might check encourages people to comply. I'd like to take a moment and turn to the packet, to the flow chart. It's on page 26 of your packet. And I apologize for not having the overhead available. But largely, that's the workflow. In essence, we'll have a complaint that will be submitted. We'll investigate the complaint. If we find the complaint is substantiated, there's a notice of violation provided. The timelines that are included in the draft resolution plans are to get in as soon as possible to deal with a zoning compliance or a building compliance meeting. All of our efforts are, where possible, to make the property that didn't comply conform to meet the code, so that if it's one where it was built with absence of permit, we can secure the permits and it can become a legal unit if the use is allowed. Largely, at that meeting, we'll go through the fact pattern associated with the complaint. We'll find out if the unit could be made legal, either through zoning method or through building code. There are different potential routes that are described in the packet, and there are others that would be combinations of those two. I think what we're trying to suggest is there's going to be a finite amount of time we'll agree to. The property owner will agree to that. As long as they follow along on the timeline to get to compliance, we've achieved our end. And that's consistent with the way we enforce codes now. We want to get to voluntary compliance in the soonest possible measure in a reasonable time. However, if they depart from that schedule, that's a compliance issue. It's forwarded over to compliance officer, and the specific location may be subject to fines and penalties. Largely, a resolution plan is just that. Let's find resolution. Let's see if we can get to some end on this. In some cases, we will, after our meeting, determine that the unit cannot be brought into compliance for a variety of reasons. If it's not unsafe, the use will be allowed to continue for a short period of time, largely at the protection of the tenant for relocation. But we will have that agreed to and stipulated. And typically the closure for us on those issues is a recording of a notice to title that says this is not allowable as a rental property. So we'll work our way through that. In the plan, we did include the draft priorities for your consideration. We'll be bringing that back for discussion again in resolution form at a future date. I should note that some concerns were raised regarding quality of life, and in comments, several comments were provided to you, and that was because we refer to significant code violations and or conditions adversely impacting quality of life. That was in reference specifically to the resolution, not to a generalized quality of life. We're talking about illegal dwelling units or illegal non-permitted construction, or parking or setback violations. Those we consider not essential to life safety, not essential to immediate action. They are life safety issues, but they are lesser importance, and that's why they fell down. I'd be happy to answer any questions about the materials of a proposed plan and update you further on this matter.
Yeah.
Terry?
Yeah. On page 14, you have a resolution plan, illegal rental units. And with that, I'm just a little explanation about, well, the meeting will determine whether the subject is a pre-existing legal non-conforming use. And then down in the next bar, it said about within 10 days, if it's pre-existing, if the subject is a pre-existing legal non-conforming use, an application will be submitted. Well, if there's no application in there, how can it be a legal pre-existing condition, you know? So could you explain and what you're looking at in terms of pre-existing condition?
Okay.
Or a non-conforming use?
Sure. Folks are allowed, consistent with state law, and to maintain a pre-existing legal non-conforming use. That's a use that's established before, either allowed by a prior zoning ordinance or regulation, or predating the zoning ordinance. If folks have that, and we have no doubt there are a number of units that would meet that, they would be prior to the establishment of these applicable rules. They need to fill out a non-conforming use certificate if we don't have one on file. And what that does is it memorializes their right to continue that use.
So what uses are you looking at?
If someone established in 1900 an ADU or had a carriage house and it was continuously used, for example, that would be allowed today.
Okay, say for example, in our neighborhood, we know there are a number of illegal detached dwelling units. What do they have, and it's in a single family neighborhood, but there was a short period where it was, but how do they, if it's pointed out that these are going on and there is no application for that, how do they need to prove that that was done within a specific window or whatever? Not that it was built,
Sure.
the garage was built, but that it was Because it's not when the garage was built, if that's what the unit is. It's when that unit was established as a dwelling unit. Is that correct?
Yeah, typically, we require them to provide proof that's either notices by the assessor, records that provided for separate electrical service, mailing or occupancy history, notices on the title itself, separate mailing addresses that were established earlier. We currently have the pre-existing non-conforming use provisions in our code. So this is the same we would do for a use that was established before the zoning changed or others, and we've been applying it for this. I should say this is not to construe the illegally established units suddenly become legal.
Well,
And-
no, that's what
yeah.
I'm wondering. That's what the concern is
Yeah.
that somehow we're going to go in and say,
No.
oh, they've been using these prior to us establishing this, so we're just going to give them a permit and say, now you're legal.
Yeah,
You know,
and
because I don't think
we-
that's quite right.
We've been down this road before. It's not unfamiliar to us. We have a set of standards one can find that can use to support that argument. It needs to
Good.
be conclusive to the point where we feel comfortable that it does predate the code itself that was applicable.
Okay. Just curious how that was going to work.
There's a rigor to
Yeah.
it. It's not just just a statement that we've had it for this time since it was there isn't adequate typically.
Well, I know others have been kind of wondering about that, so I want to
Sure.
make sure that they know.
Sure.
Other questions? Dan?
Just getting back to your comment regarding the number of inspections per year, I think you mentioned 2,700 inspections, and we have 1.5 FTE inspectors, is that correct?
There would be one inspector dedicated to this, but we could cross over and use others if we need to at periods of more intensity. Our existing inspectors will be cross-trained in this.
So there will be more than one inspector in the field at
Right.
at any given
It
time?
may be, but if you add up all the inspections at about 11 to 12 per day, it works out to about 1 FTE a year.
Okay. And then just another question regarding the maximum allotted time differences between illegal construction and basement and garage conversion and illegal rental unit. We've got 10 months for the illegal rental unit, 7 for the garage basement conversion, and then 10 for the illegal construction and illegal dwelling unit. I'm just wondering why there's the difference in there.
It's the permit turnaround and the complexity of the applications that are required in order to be able to make those work. Those are maximums allowed, and typically we try to do it sooner. But we want to realize that in each circumstance is different. And we need to sort of say fairly to get a set of plans drawn, to get those engineered if needed, to get them submitted, to get them reviewed, to get the work done. How long does that take? And in conjunction with our building official, we kind of came up and said that seems to be the outside parameters and a reasonable case to address it.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Michael?
So what we have in our packet is this draft enforcement strategy and these sample resolution plans, but some of the comment letters clearly are looking materials that are on the website that I haven't seen. And it seems like we're revisiting territory we've been in before, that somehow we'll be inspecting for chips in people's sinks, or that buildings will need to come into compliance, with building codes, which is being interpreted as new construction codes, not property maintenance codes. What is out there on the web that I haven't seen that people might be interpreting in this way?
I think some folks are viewing the draft checklist for the first time and coming to the same issues that we've discussed before this body, that the intent here is the applicable code at time of construction, that we're not looking to update all the construction to the most modern standard, that I think you recall Jim Tinner did speak specifically on this. We're looking for life safety. It's exposed wiring, it's failed systems, it's structural problems.
Not chip sinks.
Not chip sinks, no.
So, Rick, I had one question. The 1/2 time FTE that for the office assistant, is that just for the inspection component? And then
Yes,
there's additional FTE requirements for the registration part?
We have one FTE that's been hired for our registration, doing a yeoman-like job to help us. There's just a number of issues. Each inquiry has its own track to go through. Each failed letter has a whole thing. She's doing that now. We'll be going out for another half FTE, and that's to assist with enforcement as well as inspection. Largely, that individual's time is spent mostly in scheduling to get people scheduled for their inspection.
So our total team for this effort will be 2.5 FTE?
That's correct.
Got it. Okay.
And I should note that's less than many communities. I think
Yeah.
talking to Richland, they have 4 folks full-time and
Yeah.
less units than we have.
Yeah, this is very lean. Dan?
This might be just a bit in the weeds, but I've heard from constituents that there have been some concerns around systems replacements, knob and tube wiring needing to be updated, 3-prong plugs being needed in these rental units. Can you speak to those improvements and what that would look
I
like?
would defer to Jim on that matter, and certainly can get an answer for you. I don't know if he's in attendance
Doesn't
today,
appear to be here.
but I certainly can get an answer. I think he did respond on the record that we're not, if it presents a risk, and the assessments presented a risk, and he went through a couple of circumstances, we probably would look for it to be addressed. But if it's functioning, it's a different story. So I can get a more specific answer from you from the building official who really has purview on that one.
And risk is determined by the inspector?
Yes, based on their training,
Case-by-case basis?
case by case.
Thank you.
Okay, any other questions or comments? All right, we'll report this out tonight. Thank you very much, Rick. I think you're doing a great job with this. It's, again, it's a program that seems to be meeting its goals and done very efficiently and at a very low cost. I appreciate that. Thank you. That was for information and end of report.
Thank you,
End of committee.
Jack. We'll now take a 1-minute break.